Hello and welcome to your 2.2 lecture on the Qin and Han dynasties. This time period of the classical age empires for China includes two dynasties. The Qin are going to be very short-lasting but have a huge impact on the history of China as a whole, and the Han is going to be the longest dynasty in Chinese history. The rise of the Qin happened during the Warring States period. Basically, from the fall of the Zhao into the Qin, there was a time period where there were a bunch of different Chinese states, and the Qin were operating as one of those independent states. Other states were fighting each other, and the Qin kind of sat back and let them destroy each other, and then when they were weak, they came out and fought and took out everybody else. One of the things that was unique about the Qin was that during the Warring States period, they took from the other states to create a super stable government system. So they took the best of what they were seeing in the other Chinese states and using that to create their own state. They created a system called xians, which is basically districts or like counties. And these xians are going to be under the control of the Qin leader directly, which means that feudal control, so local landlords or landholders, were in charge, and that really centralizes the state. They will extend this into all of China as they take over. Farmers were actually given incentives and more honored for increasing their productivity. Merchants were punished. The Chinese as a whole do not feel that merchants are a positive thing for their society. Merchants do not necessarily work for the good of the whole. They do not necessarily, they're profit seeking. They don't help everybody. In China, and especially with Confucianism and modern day communism, the idea of community wealth rather than individual aristocracy is an important part of the Chinese culture, and it's been there and it will be there throughout its entire history. So the merchants are always on this line of not being favored. Families socially were politically split into 5 to 10 members. So the Qin state actually controlled the social situation within their state. So they were setting the stage for complete control. And each family was held responsible for the mistakes of anyone else in the family. So if someone in the family did something bad or something illegal, then the entire family was punished. And they established official law codes. And of course, this is based off of legalism. Legalism as a philosophy is the idea that humans are naturally bad, and that we as humans cannot necessarily choose the right thing to do. And so it is the state's job to create rules and create a system of rewards and punishments to ensure proper operation of social, political, economic, everything. Here's a map of all of the different states during the Warring States period. You can see that the Qin was one of the larger ones, and they did have the advantage of having a wall to protect them in the north, and they were very far west, which allowed them to have different natural resources, and they were also somewhat remote, so that allowed them to kind of stay out of the Warring States period a little bit. They were able to defeat other states because of their ability to mobilize people. Their strict law code made it easy for them to say, hey, you need to go fight in the army. And their economy was super stable. And so those two things they had a huge amount of resources. And like I said, they encouraged farming and they encouraged their farmers. So they had enough food for their military and things like that. All of that is going to help them be successful in defeating all of the other warring states. They also had, like I said, a super stable territory that they were going to be able to have a base of operations from. Legalism, like I said, was the philosophy of the Qin. They contain this idea that if a state has effective laws with rewards and punishments, then the ruler doesn't even need to be active in daily governance. So in other words, the ruler, the emperor, shouldn't have to do very much if the rules are set in place, if the laws are set in place and they're clear and they are a solid system. And so what that ends up meaning for the Qin emperors is that they actually don't do much of the day-to-day government stuff. And so they spend a lot, like Shi Huangdi will spend a lot of time doing other things than running the actual state. So this is something that is going to kind of prevail throughout all of Chinese history. The emperors a lot of times are not fully active in the running of the state. It's not like the president of the United States who is constantly involved in the running of the government. Here, the emperor, some emperors did get involved in running the state, but for the most part, throughout, something that kind of continues throughout all of the Chinese dynasties is the idea that the emperor doesn't actually do anything. So the official beginning of the Qin dynasty was in 221 BCE when Shi Huangdi took the title of emperor. Li Si was his advisor. So Li Si was really kind of like a prime minister type person. And like I said on the last slide, the emperor doesn't really do anything. So Li Si was running the show. One of the things that they did was they divided all of the Chinese land into 36 commanderies, and each commandery had an official who was appointed by the government. So these guys were handpicked. A lot of times, the people who were being picked were loyal to the Qin emperor. They were loyal to the Qin family. So this is going to change the whole hereditary rule of any territory. So they're taking out the old elites and replacing them with new ones, so that the old elites basically have no say in governance anymore. Another thing that the Qin did was that they made the aristocratic families move to the capital. Their weapons were taken and melted down by the state and made into statues. That's very symbolic of, hey, your power is over. And then any of the old city fortifications, any of the individual cities throughout the territories, the walls were taken down. And they were actually, kind of trying, the Qin, that is symbolic of the Qin trying to create one big unified state. Each commandery had a spy, and the spy would report directly to Li Si and the emperor. And so basically what the Qin have set up is a strong police state. They're controlling the movements of everyone throughout the state. What did the Qin accomplish throughout their reign was basically they standardized weights and measures. Now this is hugely important for economics. One of the biggest things is in economics is deciding how much a pound of something is worth. And if you don't have a standard measurement like the pound, it's very difficult to create any type of stability within your economic system. And the fact that the territory that the Qin were ruling over was so large that everybody had different understanding of what a pound of rice was worth. And so what they managed to do was create standard measures for those things. And they also applied these standard measures to things like road building and different other technologies as well. They also standardized the writing, the script. It's called the small script. They basically are going to, because one of the things about the standard script is that China actually has a huge amount of local languages. While the majority of the people in China today speak Mandarin or Cantonese, there's still local dialects all over the place. And especially this early in Chinese history, everybody spoke a different form of a Chinese language. And so as a result of that, it was difficult to communicate amongst the different commanderies or amongst the different people. And so what the Qin did was they created a script that was non-phonetic. So they're using pictograms instead of using any type of phonetic spelling like what we use, so that water, the symbol for water, was universal amongst all of the territories. So no matter what specific dialect you spoke or what specific language you spoke, you could understand the sign for water. They built a huge series of road networks, beginning with the capital city and then going outward. They were built with a standard measurement, the width of a cart, which is something that is advanced and new for China to do. They also standardized coinage, and these coins were circulated, and they actually punched a hole in them to show that they were minted by the emperor and by the central state, which is still in play today. The Chinese money today still uses this punched out part of their coins. and merchants were actually moved outside of the city center. Now this is going to be positive for the development of the Silk Road. Merchants again were seen as negative within most of Chinese history, and so moving them to the outskirts actually aided in developing the Silk Road. As far as scholars go, one of the biggest problems that the Chen had was the fact that legalism was so against Taoist or Confucian beliefs. And the other issue is that because they were establishing strong central control, they had to control the thought of all the citizens. So what they decided to do was that scholars had to give up all of their books. They had to turn all their books over to the state, and the state burned them. Now, obviously, a lot of scholars managed to hold on to their works, which is why we know anything about the Zhao or Confucianism or Taoism or anything like that. The Qin were not very thorough in making sure that they got all the books, but everybody was supposed to turn them in, and then they were burned. There is a story that the emperor buried 450 scholars alive. However, this account is only in a history that was written 100 years after the end of the Chen Dynasty. And the Chen Dynasty throughout Chinese historical writing has always been treated negatively. The HUANGDI was a tyrant, that the Chen Dynasty was a police state and had spies and all these kind of negative things associated with it. So whether or not he actually buried the scholars alive is up for debate. As far as expanding their territory, they continued to do this throughout their reign, and they built a canal to connect the Yangtze and the Xia River, which was actually the West River, for military transport. So they did focus on empire building with using expansion of things like roads and canal systems and water systems, and as for the purpose of not just economics but also military. They did build a wall. Now, this isn't the Great Wall. The Great Wall was built by the Ming Dynasty way later, but this is the beginnings of the idea of a wall to the north. The Chinese have always had problems with nomads in the north, and so one of the ways that they tried to protect their citizens was to create a huge wall. And in fact, a lot of times when the dynasties stopped maintaining this wall is when they got taken out. They also built a road to the north in order to deal with nomads in the north, called the Straight Road. And the Straight Road was 100% meant for military transportation. Here you can see the extent of the Chen Dynasty. You can see the Great Road going up from the capital along the Wei River, Yellow River. You can see the capital, Shenyang, towards the west of the empire. You can see the West River to the south, and then the Yangtze River to the north, and that is where they built a huge canal system there. And then you can see the building of the wall. Again, this is not the Great Wall. That wall is a little bit later, but you can see the beginning of the idea of a wall. Emperor Shi Huangdi spent most of his time dealing with his obsession with immortality. He spent a huge amount of time working with oracles and herbalists and things like that, trying to find a way to become immortal. And as a result of that, he spent a huge amount of time and money on building his tomb. The tomb was built about 30 miles east of Shenyang, and it contains the terracotta soldiers. There's about 7,000 life-size terracotta soldiers. Not all of them have been excavated. The ones that have been excavated, the excavation of the tomb started in the mid-1970s, they actually were stripped of the paint. The terracotta soldiers were actually painted, and there's still a huge amount of the tomb that hasn't been excavated because they were waiting for archaeological technology to kind of catch up with a way to excavate this area without destroying things like the paint on the terracotta soldiers. The actual tomb itself, where Shi Huangdi rests, has not been excavated either. There's all kinds of booby traps, very much like the Egyptian pyramids. They actually, inside the tomb, they found a huge working model of the empire, which actually had mechanisms for changing the flow of some of the rivers that were depicted in the model. So that was a super advanced technology. And the workers were entombed with the tomb in order to avoid anybody knowing where it was. And it was discovered in the mid-70s by a farmer. Shi Huangdi dies in 2010 BCE. He actually died because he had a dream that he was supposed to go on this trip to the coast and catch a big fish, and that would help him establish his immortality. And so on the trip, he managed to become ill, and that's when he died. The Qin were basically able to hold off a couple of rebellions after Shi Huangdi's death. There were two other Qin emperors, both of them were young, and actually Li Si managed to keep the emperor's death secret for quite some time. So there's a gap between the fall of the Qin and the rise of the Han. But ultimately, a peasant a leader named Liu Bang is going to capture the last Qin emperor, and he's going to declare himself a new ruler of a new dynasty. He changed his name to Emperor GAOZU. One thing that you will see that is common throughout these changes in dynasties for China is that the next dynasty oftentimes is started by a peasant. The idea of royalty, the idea of bloodlines that dominated European succession is not something that the Chinese really did. They had part of that is because of the concubine system and because of they were somewhat polygamous, especially in the royal family. So the idea of having strict bloodlines is not something that the Chinese have ever really paid attention to, and compared to what the Europeans do. So changing his name is basically just a way of kind of saying, hey, I'm an emperor, I'm no longer a peasant, I'm in charge. So we have two periods for the Han Dynasty. We have our Western Han Dynasty, which was 206 BCE to 9 CE, and then we have a later Han Dynasty, which we'll talk about later in the lecture. Under GAOZU's reign was 202 BCE to 195 BCE. He builds a new capital city. He moves the capital to be a little bit more central, actually, Chang'an, and Chang'an is kind of the city that's associated with the Silk Road for China. It is a huge center of commerce as well as government. He used the same commandery system that the Qin had already set up, and he replaced the rulers of the kingdoms with family members. So he's basically doing the same thing that the Qin did. He takes the old leaders out, put new ones in, and the new ones are loyal to him. He creates and gives out titles to anyone who was loyal to him. Now, this is something that's a little bit different under the Han. So if you wanted to remain in an upper echelon social class, or you wanted to remain elite, you could prove your loyalty to the emperor, and the emperor would reward you with some type of title. Now, these titles don't mean anything, but it does show favoritism between the emperor and these other families. He did create a formal bureaucratic system. At the top with him were 3 excellencies, and these 3 excellencies were served by 9 ministers, and everyone had a very specific job. So much like what we do with our Secretary of State, Secretary of Homeland Security, or whatever, he's basically creating a cabinet to help him rule his country. He uses the new Analects, which is basically a compilation of Confucianism, as a political science guide. So he's going to slowly phase out Confucianism and legalism, and put in more and more Confucian philosophies. This will eventually lead to the exam system for the Chinese government. As far as dealing with the expansion, the biggest issue he had was with these nomads called the Xiongnu in the north. He tried to defeat them, but he was very unsuccessful. He couldn't fight them. So what he decided was he created what the Chinese called a harmonious kinship. And so it's a series of marriage alliances. So basically he was marrying off his daughters to their princes. And he set a specific border between China and Xiongnu territory. And the idea is that they were going to exist and coexist peacefully. After GAOZU's death, his widow ruled as regent, and the Liu family's line managed to stay in place. However, she also, in order to maintain that family line, she did a lot of murdering. of a bunch of the higher ranking families, and she really controlled the regency of these two young rulers that are going to follow Gaozu. The next emperor you really need to know for the Han is Wendi. Wendi is going to rule from 180 BCE to 141 BCE. This is the height of the Silk Road, and this is the height of economic prosperity for China. The Han Dynasty had huge water control systems, and because of that, they were able to produce a massive amount of food for their people. And as a result, we're going to see an increase in population, which will increase artisan work, which will increase Silk Road trade, which all makes sense when we're leading into the association with the development of the Roman Empire as well. Many migrated to the south because in the north it was still controversial. The capital city was a little bit further south, and so that's partly why. And so we end up with this movement of people into the south so that we have more commercialization, larger populations in the cities as well. The state started to define belief systems for the China. One of the largest was actually dealing with ancestor worship. The emperor and the Han Dynasty actually created a system of how you're supposed to do ancestor worship. And so when you are codifying and solidifying belief systems, you're also making a unified culture. So what they're trying to do is take all these local cultures and make them more systematic, and so it's easier to control. The Romans do this as well through their Romanization process, and so we see a lot of empires that try to attempt to kind of create a centralized culture system to go with their central political system. As far as dealing with the Xiongnu, Emperor WUDI is going to be somewhat of the most successful against them. So WUDI is going to rule from 141 BCE to 87 BCE. And this is the high point of the Han Dynasty. This is also one of the high points of the Silk Road. The Xiongnu were basically, now that we're under a new emperor, they were ignoring some of the alliances and everything that was created with the previous emperors. And so they started to invade further south, and they actually managed to get super close to the capital city. So what WUDI did was he actually created an alliance of any other anti-Xiongnu throughout the region. So other tribal groups on the outskirts of what was considered Han China, and they were successful at fighting them, but they couldn't conquer them. So the Xiongnu are still going to be in place, but they were able to kind of hold them off. As far as other expansion goes, WUDI decides to expand into the northern Korean peninsula as well as into Vietnam. So he really expanded the territory of what the Han Dynasty controlled. Under WUDI, Confucianism becomes the philosophy and culture of not only the state, not only the politics, but also of all the people. WUDI was a student to someone who he created a more systematic version of Confucianism. And as that, for the ruler, he created this idea of the threefold obligations of the ruler. So the ruler was supposed to do three things under Confucian ideology. 1, make appropriate sacrifices and set the correct moral example. 2, perform symbolic acts for nature. So in other words, literally go out there and plow a field every now and then. And 3, establish schools and enlighten the people. This third part is what will lead to the civil servant exam. What they decided to do was, instead of using family lines and instead of using loyalty and fake titles and things like that, they decided to create an academy, basically. Teach people in Confucian ideology, teach people in the ideology of the government, in the ways of the government, give these people an exam, and if they, and then based on their scores, they would be given a government job. This actually creates social mobility. The government was controlling the economy still, so this is the only form of social mobility that was available. It was not absolute. Obviously, in order for a peasant to get a government job, he would need to go to the academy. And in order to do that, that family would have to sacrifice a huge amount in order to get this kid into the academy. So it wasn't true social mobility, but the appearance of social mobility was just as important. As far as the economy goes, the state is going to nationalize, which basically means the government controls essential industries. And in this case, our essential industries at this point are both salt and iron industries. Both of these industries are important to food development, especially as we're developing more and more tools for agriculture with the use of iron during this time period. The government, the problem is that Confucian teaches that the leader should be an example rather than authoritative, and so controlling the economy is actually against Confucian ideology. And so we have a conflict here between the Confucianism that the government wants to use and the reality of their economic situation. We will actually discuss more of this with your first DBQ essay. After WUDI died, the empire struggled with succession. There was a lot of people getting murdered, taking the throne, and then someone takes them out. So it just was a little bit not unstable in regards to succession. And of course, border control was a problem as well. And since the economy was being controlled by the state, there's many that felt that the state control of the economy was really bad and was causing problems, which you'll actually see in the DBQ. The government gives up its economic control, and as a result, landlords increase taxation on the peasants, which will make the peasants angry. And so we're going to see a huge shift here and basically the decline of the Western Han. Wang Mang was he was a royal. He lived in the royal house. He was from a royal family, and he basically manages to become regent to a child king from 7 to 1 BCE, and then he took the title emperor himself in 9 CE. He made very dramatic, radical changes to the economy of the Han Dynasty. He nationalized the land, so he's basically taking control of the landlords away so that that taxation of the peasants would stop. And he tried to establish an equal field system where everybody had the same amount of lands that was needed to provide the resources for your family. He also renationalized the salt and iron industries, and he also set controls on grain, silk, and cloth. So he's really establishing massive government control of the economy. He created another coin system, and the rich actually had to turn their gold in exchange for coins, which strips them of their power. And it also gives the government some money. New taxes were put in place, but he didn't tax the peasants or the farmers. He taxed the merchants and the craftsmen, which is going to impact the Silk Road on a large scale. He's going to establish a new agreement with the Xiongnu, and he actually was doing quite a bit with technology and scientific research. He was encouraging these things. He was killed by rebels in 23 CE, so he didn't rule very long, and he technically wasn't Han either. There's two ways that his reign is written about in Chinese history. One is that he's a usurper, he took the throne, he shouldn't have been there, he was radical, he tried to make all these changes that nobody wanted. And the other side is that he's a pragmatist, and a pragmatist ruler means that he saw what needed to be done and was willing to do what needed to be done to try to create more stability. We'll see this term later on as well. However, so his rule is very controversial in Chinese history in regards to his acceptance, whether perhaps all these radical changes and the people who thought that he was a usurper were just the upper class who were impacted by this. There's no way to know how the peasants felt about this because they can't read or write. So his rule is very unknown, and there's a lot that we know what he did, but we aren't really sure how it was received by the masses at all. So the Eastern Han Dynasty officially starts with the end of Wang Mang and into the beginning of a new family, a new Han family, which lasts from, this is the end of the Han Dynasty, but it lasts from 25 to 220. It took 10 years to reestablish the dynasty after Wang Mang. So there was a lot of infighting. A lot of people were trying to take the throne. It was very difficult to actually set up a new emperor. One of the things that they did was they moved the capital. It's 200 miles east of Cheyenne because the west was a little bit difficult to control. With this city begins the idea of somewhat of a forbidden city. Now, the forbidden city, again, is not built. It's the Ming built the forbidden city as well as the Great Wall, but the idea of it. And inside the city walls were the palace, government buildings, and the residence of the nobles and the officials. And then everybody else lived, normal citizens lived outside the walls and to like a suburb type of system. The idea was that there would be enough room if there was an attack that the citizens in the suburbs could get inside the walls. Sometimes that didn't happen. And the city did serve as a center of commerce. We do see the Silk Road still working at this point. It's really at the end of the Han Dynasty where the Silk Road definitely falls apart. The Eastern Han Dynasty introduced something called a corvée labor system. A corvée system is where you pay a tax, but it's a labor tax, not necessarily like a coin tax. So in order to pay your taxes to the government, you would have to go work on some type of public project for a certain amount of time of the year. We will see this corvée labor system used throughout history with different empires. It's a way to get work done without paying anyone, and the people saw it as their obligation to the state, not necessarily as something as, not everyone saw it as like a negative thing. They spent a huge amount of time building roads and bridges and fixing some of the stuff that the Qin had built, fixing some of the stuff that the earlier Han Dynasty had built as well. They did really good work when it comes to water systems, and they actually managed to increase their technology with farming by using an iron plow that was able to connect to drought animals like the oxen and things like that. So they're making the agriculture more efficient. However, the peasants couldn't afford these technologies, and so we're getting a huge split between the social classes. So you're getting super poor, and then people who can't afford the technologies. And whenever you lose a middle class, you're going to have rebellion. As far as administrative practices, they kept everything from the previous Han rule. They had the 3 excellencies again, then there were the 9 ministers under the excellencies, and at this point there's 100 commanderies. And then they further divided those into counties or xians, which was started under the Qin, and each one of those had an appointed official who took the Confucian exam. Because there's so many more government jobs, more and more people were getting access to the Confucian exams. As far as expansion during the Eastern Han Dynasty, they do regain control of northern Vietnam. They regain control of the west eventually. And the Xiongnu were having internal problems. The Xiongnu nomads were actually infighting, and so that made it more peaceful for the Han. And the Han were actually able to expand past that original wall built by the Qin. The Middle Han Dynasty was a time period we call 88 to 168. Unfortunately, there was fighting amongst the scholars in regards to Confucianism and how to actually run the country. And then the families were also fighting at court. And so we ended up with a series of minors who were in charge, and empresses and regents were basically ruling the country, which in Confucianism and in a patriarchal society, it's very difficult to have an empress in charge. Scholars and exam takers weren't given positions of power anymore, and they were basically government jobs were now being handed out to family members rather than to the scholars taking the exams. So that social mobility was gone. And again, like I said, when you lose that middle class and you lose the idea of being able to move up socially, you're going to end up with rebellion. Our later Han Dynasty, which is 168 to 220, again, succession disputes. Nobody's really even sure who the true emperor is at certain points throughout this later Han Dynasty, and the officials were no longer chosen by merit but by bribery. Like I said, the Confucian exam system was pretty much gone, and so people were able to buy their way into offices. Peasants were organizing rebellions because the poorer peasants did not have access to technology like everybody else. They were not necessarily meeting their basic needs anymore. There were 3 claims to the throne at one point from 189 to 220, and I wasn't sure who actually was in charge. Eventually, the last one just abdicated the throne, and the dynasty officially ended in 220. As a result of this, China, what we call China, will enter into another period of division. It wasn't necessarily as volatile as the previous warring states period. The states weren't necessarily fighting each other on a large scale during this period of division from 220 to 589. However, one of the biggest impacts of the fall of the Han Dynasty was the issue with the Silk Road. The Silk Road's basically going to shut down, and as a result of that, we're going to see economic crisis in Rome, which will ultimately also cause problems for the Roman Empire as well. Here you can see the Han Dynasty at its height and the wall that was built to the north, and you can see the 2 different capitals. So you can see that they never fully got to the coast on the eastern border completely, but you can see that they did get further north, which is something that because the Xiongnu were having internal problems. And you can see going into a little bit of Southeast Asia there, and further into the west. So the Han Dynasty is our longest lasting Chinese dynasty, but it was actually split up into 2 time periods, as well as being one of the key players in the Silk Road, makes the Han Dynasty super important.